Touch that monitor again, and I will personally make sure you never hold a stethoscope in the state of Texas." The voice carried the acoustics of someone accustomed to owning every room she entered. It traveled the length of the pre-op corridor on the 4th floor of Callaway Memorial Medical Center, past the scrub sinks, past the anesthesia cart parked at a careless angle, past the overhead speaker that had just finished paging a code team to the ICU, and it landed on the back of a woman in blue scrubs who had committed the unforgivable sin of adjusting a cardiac monitor that was reading 40 beats too high. The woman in blue did not flinch, did not turn around. She finished recalibrating the lead placement on the patient's chest with hands that moved like they had done this 10,000 times before, steady, unhurried, precise, and only then looked up. She had just been threatened by the chief executive officer of a 400-bed hospital, a woman whose name appeared on the building's board of directors roster, on its federal tax filings, on its Medicare enrollment certification. She was wrong about the stethoscope. She was wrong about the state of Texas. And in approximately 6 weeks, when the sealed federal investigation file landed on the desk of the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Texas, she would learn exactly how wrong she had been about everything. But that was later. Right now, the 4th floor corridor of Callaway Memorial smelled like betadine and recycled air. The overhead fluorescents buzzed at a frequency designed to make people compliant. And a travel nurse named Nadine Calloway, no relation to the name on the building, or so her staffing agency paperwork indicated, pressed 2 fingers against the patient's radial pulse, counted for 15 seconds, multiplied by 4, and wrote the corrected reading on the bedside chart without a word. The PA system crackled. A dispatcher's voice, flat and procedural. "Security to OR Suite 4. Security to OR Suite 4. Unauthorized access. 4th floor observation gallery." Somewhere above them, behind glass that overlooked the surgical theater, someone was watching who was not supposed to be watching. And on the corridor below, a CEO who had just threatened the wrong woman turned on her heel and walked toward the elevator bank, heels clicking a rhythm that sounded like ownership. The monitor beeped steadily now. Correct reading. Correct rhythm. The patient, a 63-year-old man scheduled for a triple bypass in the morning, would never know that the first person to notice his leads were misplaced was someone the hospital treated as disposable. Nadine capped her pen, slid it into her scrub pocket, and stood perfectly still for 4 seconds, watching the elevator doors close on Celeste Marrin's retreating figure, memorizing the time, 7:22 p.m., with the reflexive discipline of someone for whom timestamps were not habit, but profession. If this satisfying story already has you hooked, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. You will not want to miss what happens when the truth comes out. 6 days earlier, Nadine had walked through the main entrance of Callaway Memorial, carrying a single duffel bag and a staffing agency folder that identified her as a registered nurse, surgical services, temporary contract, 12 weeks. The lobby was the kind of space hospitals built when they wanted donors to feel important. Polished terrazzo floors, a water feature trickling over river stones, a brass plaque near the information desk that read, "Founded 1971 by Dr. Harold Callaway, dedicated to healing without distinction." The plaque was tarnished at the edges. Nobody had polished it in a long time. The human resources coordinator who processed her paperwork was a thin woman with reading glasses on a chain who handed Nadine a badge, a locker assignment, and a photocopied orientation packet that was missing pages 7 through 12. "Surgical services is 4th floor. Report to Dirk Lazenby, OR manager. He'll get you oriented." The coordinator looked at Nadine's credentials without really seeing them. 2 years at Grady Memorial in Atlanta, 1 year at Johns Hopkins, current Texas compact license, certifications in ACLS, BLS, and PALS. Nothing that would make someone look twice, or so they were designed to suggest. Any questions? Where's the staff parking? Lot C. Behind the loading dock. Badge won't work for Lot A. That's physicians and administration only. The coordinator said it the way people said things they had stopped hearing as strange. Lot A was covered, shaded 30 feet from the entrance. Lot C was open asphalt, unshaded, a 4-minute walk past the dumpsters and the linen delivery bay. The sorting happened before you even made it inside. Nadine thanked her, clipped the badge to her scrub top, and took the service elevator to 4. The surgical floor had the controlled chaos of a department running at 93% capacity. 8 operating suites, 2 of them currently in use, the rest being turned over by a housekeeping crew that moved with the exhausted efficiency of people who had been doing this since 5 a.m. The air smelled like surgical drape adhesive and the particular brand of floor cleaner that every hospital in America seemed to buy from the same distributor. Dirk Lazenby sat behind a desk in the OR manager's office, a glass-walled room that allowed him to surveil the corridor in both directions. He was mid-40s, lean, with the restless energy of someone who needed to be in charge of logistics the way some people needed caffeine. His desk was organized with military precision, clipboard centered, pens aligned, schedule printout taped to the wall with edges trimmed to exact right angles. Nadine Calloway, travel nurse, 12 weeks. He read from her file without looking up. Grady, Hopkins, you bounce around. That's the nature of travel nursing. We have systems here, protocols. The way things work in Atlanta or Baltimore is not necessarily how things work at Callaway Memorial. He set down the file and looked at her for the first time. His eyes moved from her face to her badge to the lanyard style she had chosen, clipped, not hanging, and then back to her face. You'll shadow Tomas Aguilar for your first 3 shifts, senior scrub tech. He'll show you how we do things. Understood. One more thing. Lazenby stood. He was taller than she expected, 6'1", maybe 6'2", and he used the height the way tall people sometimes do in institutional settings as a spatial declaration. Supply chain is my department. You need something from the equipment room, you log it. Every item. Every time. I find discrepancies. I don't ask questions first. I write up. Clear? Clear. He nodded, handed her a pager, motioned toward the corridor. Conversation over. Tomas Aguilar was already scrubbing in for an afternoon appendectomy when Nadine found him at the sinks outside Suite 6. He was mid-50s, compact, with forearms that showed 18 years of setting up surgical trays, the kind of quiet physical competence that comes from repetition so thorough it becomes meditation. He glanced at her badge, then at her face, and something in his expression softened. Travel? 12 weeks. Welcome to the circus. He said it quietly, without malice, but the word choice landed. He turned back to the sink. Watch the count boards. Lazenby audits them personally. If a sponge count is off by 1, he'll have your badge in his desk drawer before you can explain. Noted. And stay clear of Dr. Selden during the first 20 minutes of any procedure. She doesn't like new faces in her OR, especially... He stopped himself, adjusted the water temperature. She's particular. The word he had not said hung between them like a held breath. Nadine let it pass. She had been filling in unfinished sentences her entire career. That first evening, back in her rented studio apartment 6 blocks from the hospital, Nadine sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a lined notebook beside it. She transcribed everything she had observed during the day, not in the casual way of someone journaling about a new job, but in the systematic, time-stamped, cross-referenced format of someone who had been trained to build evidentiary records that survived legal challenge. Every interaction logged, every name spelled correctly and matched against the employee directory she had memorized before her first shift. Every deviation from posted protocol noted with the specific policy reference it violated. She worked for 90 minutes, closed the laptop, encrypted the file, transferred it to a portable drive that she stored in a fireproof pouch she kept in her bag. Not in the apartment, never in the apartment. Then she made dinner. Rice, black beans, a sliced avocado. Ate standing at the counter the way people eat when they are used to meals being functional rather than social. Washed the dish immediately. Wiped the counter. Set the bag by the door for morning. Routine. Discipline. The small rituals of someone whose life required compartmentalization so thorough that even the placement of a bag by a door followed a pattern. Always on the left side, always with the zipper facing the wall, always within arm's reach of the exit. She did not unpack the duffel. 6 days in, she still had not unpacked the duffel. The rented studio looked like a place someone was passing through, which, in the way that mattered most, it was. The confrontation with Boyd Strattan happened on day 3. Nadine was walking from the staff break room to the supply corridor on 4, carrying a cup of coffee she would not finish because the overhead page would interrupt her before the second sip. The corridor was empty. 7:45 a.m. Shift change. The brief window when the floor belonged to whoever was walking it. Strattan appeared from the stairwell door. He was a large man, 6'3", 240, the build of someone who had spent years in corrections and brought the posture with him when he transferred to hospital security. He wore his badge on a lanyard that swung against his chest like a pendulum. His belt carried a radio, a flashlight, and a restraint kit that most hospital security officers did not carry because most hospital security officers did not come from facilities where restraint was a primary job function. He stopped walking when he saw her. Not the gradual deceleration of someone adjusting their path, the deliberate stop of someone deciding whether to let another person pass. Badge. Nadine looked at him. Her badge was clipped to her scrub top, photo facing outward, clearly visible. The same badge she had been wearing every shift for 3 days. The same badge that every employee in the building wore in the same location. It's on my chest. I need to see it, up close. He stepped forward, not sideways, not to create space for her to walk past, forward, closing the distance between them from 8 feet to 3. New staff, protocol. There was no such protocol. Nadine had read the hospital's security manual, all 94 pages of it, including the appendix on visitor credentialing, before her first shift. Section 12, subsection C. Security personnel may request visual confirmation of employee identification. Physical inspection of badges is reserved for incidents involving suspected credential fraud and requires supervisor authorization. She did not cite the manual, did not argue. Unclipped the badge and held it out at arm's length. He took it, brought it close to his face, studied it with theatrical slowness. Photo, name, department, expiration date. Then looked at her face, then back at the photo, then back at her face, as if performing a comparison that required extraordinary effort. Callaway. He read the name with a tone that could have been curiosity or could have been a test. Same as the building. Common name. He held the badge for 4 more seconds, then handed it back, not to her hand, but dropped it so she had to catch it before it hit the floor. A small gesture of dominance, practiced, deniable, just careless enough to explain away, just deliberate enough to communicate exactly what it was intended to communicate. Welcome to Callaway Memorial. He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Nadine reclipped the badge, walked past him, did not look back, noted the time, 7:47 a.m., and the name, Boyd Strattan, head of security, badge number 417, and added both to the file she would update that evening. 3 days, 3 shifts. And already the building was sorting her into categories that had nothing to do with her nursing credentials and everything to do with assumptions made before she had spoken a single clinical word. Celeste Marrin had not always been the woman who threatened nurses in corridors. 22 years ago, she had been the 20-year-old in secondhand scrubs who arrived at Callaway Memorial's nursing assistant program with $47 in her checking account and a bus transfer that was 4 minutes from expiring. She had walked into the building through a side entrance that no longer existed, the old wing, demolished in 2014 to make room for the surgical pavilion, and she had stood in a hallway that smelled like floor wax and boiled vegetables, holding a folder of documents that proved she had graduated from a Houston community college with a 3.8 GPA while working 2 jobs and sleeping in her car for 3 months of her sophomore year. The woman who found her standing there, lost, underfed, pretending she was neither, was Hattie Rollins, head nurse, 41 years old, hands that could start an IV in a collapsed vein and hold a frightened child at the same time. She had looked at the girl in the hallway and seen something that most people missed when they looked at women who showed up at hospitals with empty bank accounts and full transcripts. "You eat today?" Hattie had asked. Celeste had not eaten. Hattie had taken her to the cafeteria, bought her a plate of whatever the steam trays held that day, mashed potatoes, green beans, chicken that tasted like institutional kindness, and sat across from her while she ate. Did not ask why she was thin. Did not ask about the car. Did not make her perform gratitude in exchange for the meal. When the plate was empty, Hattie had pulled a stethoscope from the pocket of her scrub jacket, her own, the one she had carried for 19 years, and pressed it into Celeste's hands. "Heal first, climb later." 3 words. Celeste would remember them for 22 years, would remember the weight of that stethoscope, would remember the way Hattie's hands felt when they closed around hers, warm, calloused, absolutely steady. She would also, eventually, forget what those words meant. But that was later. On that day in the demolished hallway, a hungry girl with a full transcript accepted a stethoscope from a woman who believed that healing was not a career, but a covenant. And the building that would one day carry her, borrowed authority, watched from its walls, saying nothing, remembering everything. The first anomaly appeared on Nadine's 7th shift. She was doing a routine pre-op check on a patient in bed 4, a 58-year-old woman named Gloria Fuentes, scheduled for a laparoscopic cholecystectomy the following morning. Standard procedure. Routine surgery. The kind of case that should not generate questions. Except the chart did not match the patient. The surgical consent form listed a total abdominal hysterectomy, a procedure Mrs. Fuentes had not discussed with anyone, according to her own verbal account. The diagnosis code on the form was 182.0, malignant neoplasm of the corpus uteri, uterine cancer. But Mrs. Fuentes' admitting diagnosis, clearly documented on her intake paperwork from 12 hours earlier, was K80.20, calculus of gallbladder without obstruction. Gallstones. 2 entirely different body systems, 2 entirely different procedures, and a consent form that, if signed, would authorize a surgical team to remove an organ the patient did not need removed. Nadine read both documents twice, placed them side by side on the bedside table, then read them a third time, slowly, tracing each line with her fingertip the way someone does when they are checking whether the error is theirs or someone else's. It was not hers. "Mrs. Fuentes, can you tell me what surgery you're expecting tomorrow?" The woman in the bed, tired, nervous, the IV drip humming its quiet metronome beside her, looked confused. "My gallbladder. Dr. Selden said gallbladder. Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. I'm just confirming your chart." Nadine kept her voice level, calm, clinical. The voice of someone who has learned that tone communicates safety more reliably than words. "You rest. I'm going to step out and verify some paperwork." She carried the chart to the nursing station, found Lazenby's office door open, knocked on the frame. The consent form for bed 4 doesn't match the admitting diagnosis. It lists a hysterectomy. The patient is here for cholecystectomy. Lazenby looked up from his clipboard. His expression did not change, or rather, it changed in the specific way that expressions change when someone has been expecting a question and has already prepared the answer. "Clerical error. Happens all the time. I'll have it corrected." The diagnosis code is also wrong. 182.0 instead of K80.20. That's not a typo. That's a different ICD-10 category entirely. Which is why we have a verification process. You caught it. Good. I'll handle it. He reached for the chart. His fingers closed on the edge. Nadine did not release it immediately. 1 second. 2 seconds. A small resistance that communicated something beyond the paperwork. The acknowledgement that this was not random, that mismatching a diagnosis code by that degree required either catastrophic incompetence or deliberate input. She released the chart. Lazenby pulled it to his side of the desk. Conversation over. Nadine turned to leave. She was 2 steps into the corridor when Lazenby's voice hit her back. Callaway. She stopped, turned. He was standing now behind the desk but leaning forward with both palms flat on the surface. When you find discrepancies, you bring them to me. Not to nursing admin, not to the charge nurse, not to anyone else. My department, my process, you understand? I understand the chain of command. Good. He came around the desk. 3 steps, fast, closer than professional distance required. His hand closed around her forearm, not gently, not violently, but with the specific pressure of someone who wanted to communicate control through physical contact that could be denied later. Because the last travel nurse who decided to play detective lasted 4 shifts. I don't know what they teach at Grady or Hopkins, but here, you stay in your lane. He released her arm. The pressure marks would be visible for 20 minutes. She could feel them as she walked back to the nursing station. 4 fingertip impressions on the soft underside of her forearm, each one a small oval of heat that pulsed with her heartbeat. She did not rub her arm, did not look at the marks, did not give Lazenby the satisfaction of knowing his grip had registered. At the nursing station, she sat at the workstation and pulled up the hospital's electronic health record system, logged into her temporary account, navigated to the chart for bed 4, and found that the consent form had already been corrected, the hysterectomy replaced with cholecystectomy, the diagnosis code updated to K80.20, the original entry overwritten without an audit trail notation. In any properly configured EHR system, corrections to consent forms generated an automatic audit log. The original entry would be preserved, time-stamped, with the correcting user's credentials attached. That was not optional. It was a CMS condition of participation required for every facility enrolled in Medicare. No audit trail, she said quietly, to no one. Then, even more quietly, documented. The word slipped out like muscle memory, the vocabulary of a world she was not supposed to inhabit in these scrubs, in this role on this floor. She caught it immediately, glanced around. Nobody had heard. The nursing station was empty except for her and the hum of monitors showing stable vitals from 8 post-op beds. She logged out, wrote nothing on the hospital's system. The documentation that mattered, the real documentation, the kind that would hold up under federal evidentiary standards, would happen later in the encrypted file on the portable drive, in the precise format she had been trained to use, because clerical errors did not overwrite themselves without audit trails, because diagnosis codes for uterine cancer did not accidentally appear on gallbladder charts, and because the speed with which Lazenby had corrected the record, less than 7 minutes, suggested that he knew exactly where to find the original and exactly how to make it disappear. That evening, in the studio apartment, Nadine updated her case file with a new entry. Day 7. Chart discrepancy. Patient Fuentes. Gloria. Pre-op consent listed ICD-10182. 0. Malignant neoplasm uteri. Admitting diagnosis. K80.20. Cholelithiasis. Corrected by Lazenby within 7 minutes of report. No audit trail generated. EHR system appears configured to permit overwrites without mandatory logging. Potential violation of 42 CFR Section 482.24. Medical Record Services, Conditions of Participation. Cross-reference with CMS billing data request filed March 3rd. She encrypted the file, transferred the drive, set the bag by the door, left side, zipper facing the wall. The social architecture of Callaway Memorial's surgical department operated on rules that were never written down, but universally understood. Dr. Margot Selden was the architect, chief of surgery, board-certified in general and cardiothoracic specialties, 17 years at Callaway Memorial. She had been recruited by the previous administration, retained by the current one, and protected by a contract that made her functionally untouchable. A $2.3 million annual package with a termination clause that would cost the hospital 18 months' salary if they let her go without cause. She was, in every practical sense, the most expensive person in the building who was not the CEO, and she ran her department like a closed ecosystem. The surgeons were her surgeons. The anesthesiologists deferred to her preferences. The scrub techs knew her instrument layout by heart, and the nurses who rotated through her operating rooms did so at her pleasure, which meant that some nurses rotated regularly and some nurses did not rotate at all. The sorting was not random. Tomas explained it on Nadine's 9th shift, while they were restocking the instrument trays for the following day's schedule. He spoke carefully, the way people speak when they are describing something they have seen too many times to pretend they have not seen it. Dr. Selden prefers consistency in her OR teams. She has a list. If you're on the list, you scrub in. If you're not on the list, you work recovery, supply, or pre-op. And who makes the list? Dr. Selden. He set down a retractor with the gentleness of someone who knew every instrument personally. She'll evaluate you during your first week. If she likes your work, you're in. If she doesn't, he shrugged. It was not a shrug of indifference. It was a shrug of exhaustion. Has she evaluated me? She evaluated you the minute you walked onto the floor. He paused, met her eyes. I've been here 18 years. I've watched 23 travel nurses come through surgical. 14 were pulled off the OR rotation within their first 2 weeks. All 14 were Black or Latina. He said it without emphasis, without drama, as a statement of data. The way someone reports a pattern they have documented long enough to remove personal feeling from the equation. Nadine said nothing, but she noted the number, 14, and the specificity with which Tomas had tracked it. And she thought about a man who had spent 18 years counting injustices he could not stop because counting was the only form of resistance the institution had left him. The exclusion came on day 10. Lazenby posted the OR schedule for the following week on the bulletin board outside his office at 3:15 p.m., 45 minutes before the end of the day shift. Nadine was assigned to pre-op assessment and recovery. No scrub-in rotations, no case assists, no contact with active surgical procedures for the entire 7-day cycle. 3 other travel nurses on the same contract had full OR rotations. All 3 were white. Nadine photographed the schedule with her personal phone, did not complain, did not ask for explanation, carried the photograph to her apartment that evening, and added it to the case file with a cross-reference to Tomas's informal audit. 14 travel nurses removed from OR rotation, demographics consistent with pattern. The billing anomaly surfaced 3 days later, not through investigation, but through the kind of accident that happens when institutions grow careless with the details of their corruption. Nadine was in the supply room on 4, logging surgical glove inventory, a task Lazenby had assigned her as a pointed reminder that non-OR nurses did non-OR work, when she noticed an open workstation in the corner. The screen had not locked. The previous user had navigated away from the hospital's internal portal, but had left a browser tab open behind it. A tab showing the Medicare Administrative Contractors Claims Portal, Novitas Solutions, with a batch submission queued for review. She should not have looked. Under any other circumstances, she would not have looked. But the portal showed a batch of 47 surgical claims submitted for reimbursement in the current quarter, and the third claim on the list, highlighted in yellow, flagged for manual review, was for patient Fuentes. Gloria, date of service matching the cholecystectomy that had been performed 2 days earlier. The billed procedure was not cholecystectomy. The billed procedure was CPT code 58150, total abdominal hysterectomy, the same procedure that had appeared on the mismatched consent form. The form Lazenby had corrected within 7 minutes, the form whose original entry had vanished without an audit trail. The chart had been fixed. The patient had received the correct surgery, but the bill submitted to Medicare, the federal claim that would trigger reimbursement from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, listed a more expensive procedure that had never been performed. Medicare reimbursement for laparoscopic cholecystectomy, approximately $4,800. Medicare reimbursement for total abdominal hysterectomy, approximately $12,600. A difference of $7,800 on a single claim. Nadine read the claim number aloud, under her breath, the way people read numbers they need to remember. Claim 2274-09-MAC, patient identifier ending 731. She did not take a photograph, did not touch the workstation. The screen's cookies and access logs would record any interaction, and her fingerprints on the keyboard would create questions she could not afford to answer yet. She picked up the box of surgical gloves she had come for, walked out of the supply room, and returned to pre-op as if nothing had happened. That evening, the case file grew by 3 pages. Cross-referenced. Consent form discrepancy, EHR, overwrite without audit trail, Medicare claim submitted for non-performed procedure, potential violation of the False Claims Act, 31 U.S.C., Section 3729. Potential violation of the Anti-Kickback Statute, 42 U.S.C. Section 1320, A-7B, if referring physicians received compensation for surgical referrals billed at inflated rates. The pattern was forming. Not yet proven. One claim was an anomaly, not a scheme. But the infrastructure was visible. A CEO who controlled billing, a compliance officer who buried reports, an OR manager who corrected charts without trails, and a chief of surgery whose patient volume justified the numbers only if you did not look too closely at what was actually being done in her operating rooms. If you want to see what happens when the walls start closing in, subscribe now and turn on notifications. This story is about to take a turn nobody saw coming. Nadine filed the report the next morning. The hospital's internal compliance system, a web-based portal accessible from any workstation, had a form titled Billing Discrepancy Report. Yes, it required the reporting employee's name, badge number, the patient case number, a description of the discrepancy, and a digital signature attesting that the information was provided in good faith. Standard whistleblower intake. The kind of mechanism every Medicare-enrolled facility was required to maintain under the terms of its federal participation agreement. Nadine filled it out completely. Patient name, case number, the mismatch between the performed cholecystectomy and the billed hysterectomy. The claim number she had memorized from the Novitas portal, 2274-09-MAC. The absence of an audit trail for the consent form correction. Every detail formatted with the clinical precision of someone who understood that compliance reports were legal documents, not suggestion boxes. She submitted it at 7:04 a.m. before her shift started, from the workstation in the staff break room. The response came at 1:37 p.m., not by email. The portal did not generate confirmations, which was itself a compliance deficiency, but in person, delivered by Faye Gannon, who appeared at the nursing station with a manila folder and the expression of someone performing a task she had performed many times before. Gannon was mid-40s, carefully assembled, pressed blazer, reading glasses on a beaded chain, hair pulled back in a style that suggested order was a personal philosophy rather than a professional requirement. She was the hospital's compliance officer, which meant she was responsible for ensuring that Callaway Memorial adhered to federal and state healthcare regulations, investigated internal reports of fraud or waste, and maintained the documentation that proved the hospital deserved the Medicare dollars it received. It also meant she reported directly to Celeste Marrin. Ms. Calloway, I received your billing discrepancy report. Gannon opened the manila folder. Inside was a single printed page, Nadine's submission, with a yellow sticky note attached to the top right corner. The note contained 3 handwritten words: resolved, coding error. I reviewed the claim in question with our billing department. The CPT code was entered incorrectly during batch processing, a transposition error. The claim has been corrected and resubmitted to the MAC with the appropriate code. The original consent form discrepancy was a concurrent data entry issue that has been addressed through our standard quality assurance process. She recited the explanation with the fluency of someone reading from a script she had memorized, each sentence polished smooth by repetition, every potential follow-up question preemptively addressed by language so thoroughly vague that it could mean anything and therefore meant nothing. A transposition error changes 58150 to 47562? Nadine asked. The CPT codes for hysterectomy and cholecystectomy shared no digits. Transposition, switching the order of numbers, could not produce one from the other. It was arithmetically impossible. Gannon's expression did not change. The billing department's internal review concluded that the error originated during batch entry. I'm not a coder. I rely on their technical expertise for the specifics. The codes share no common digits. That's not transposition. That's a different procedure entered from scratch. Ms. Calloway. Gannon closed the folder. The sticky note disappeared inside it, 3 handwritten words sealing the conversation like a wax stamp. Your report has been received, investigated, and resolved. The corrective action has been documented. I appreciate your vigilance. It demonstrates exactly the kind of staff engagement our compliance program depends on. She smiled. It was a compliance officer's smile, warm enough to satisfy a checklist, cold enough to communicate that the checklist was now complete. If you have future concerns, please continue to use the portal. We take every report seriously. She left. The manila folder left with her, carrying Nadine's report to whatever filing cabinet or shredder awaited documents that had been resolved before anyone with authority to act had seen them. Nadine sat at the nursing station for 30 seconds after Gannon departed. Then she opened her personal phone, navigated to the encrypted notes application, and typed a single entry. Day 13. Compliance report filed 0704. Closed by Gannon at 1337. Explanation provided. Transposition error. Explanation is mathematically impossible. Report appears pre-resolved. Sticky note present on printed submission before Gannon arrived at station. Implication: billing department and compliance coordinated response prior to investigation. Potential obstruction of internal compliance mechanism. Cross-reference 31 U.S.C. Section 3730, qui tam relator protections. She locked the phone, returned to her shift, and understood, with a clarity that settled like concrete, that the compliance portal at Callaway Memorial was not a reporting mechanism. It was a containment system, designed to identify people who noticed problems, document their names, and neutralize their concerns before those concerns could reach anyone outside the building's walls. The second encounter with Strattan was not an encounter. It was a message. Nadine was leaving the hospital at 8:20 p.m. on day 12, walking through the ground floor corridor that connected the main building to the staff parking lot, when she heard footsteps behind her. Heavy, deliberate, the boot-fall cadence of someone who wanted to be heard. She kept walking. The corridor was long, fluorescent lit, lined with locked office doors. After hours, it was empty. The kind of institutional space that exists between the public-facing hospital and the service infrastructure. Neither clinical nor administrative, just concrete and fluorescence, and the faint smell of boiler steam from the mechanical room at the far end. Hold up. She stopped, turned. Strattan was 10 feet behind her, radio at his hip, flashlight in hand, despite the fully lit corridor. Bag check. I'm an employee. I'm wearing my badge. After-hours protocol. All bags subject to inspection. He closed the distance. 8 feet, 5 feet, 3. There was no after-hours bag check protocol. Section 19 of the Security Manual. Random bag inspections may be conducted at building exits during declared security events. Declaration must be issued by the Chief Security Officer or hospital administrator and communicated to all staff via overhead page. No page had been made. No security event had been declared. This was not a protocol. This was a man with a flashlight and a disposition, standing between a woman and her car. Nadine opened her bag, held it toward him. Key. Inside, a water bottle, a granola bar wrapper, a phone charger, her car keys, and a novel she had not had time to read. Nothing else. The portable drive was in the fireproof pouch in a zippered compartment that looked from the outside like part of the bag's structural padding. Strattan shined the flashlight into the bag, moved items around with one thick finger. The flashlight beam landed on the novel, a paperback with a cracked spine, the kind of book people carry to hospital break rooms and never finish. A lot of reading material for a nurse. He said it with the inflection of someone who had decided what the sentence meant before he said it. I like to read. He pulled the novel out, flipped through the pages, let them fall open, checking for what? Concealed documents, stolen supplies, evidence that a woman who carried a book was somehow more suspicious than a woman who did not. Then he dropped the book back into the bag, and in the same motion stepped forward and pressed his palm flat against the wall behind her left shoulder, not touching her, but close enough that his arm formed a barrier between her body and the corridor she needed to walk through. His face was 18 inches from hers. His breath smelled like the chemical mint of nicotine lozenges. I know every inch of this building, every camera, every blind spot, every door that locks from the outside. His voice was low now, conversational, the volume of someone saying something they want only one person to hear. Travel nurses come and go. Security stays. He held the position for 3 seconds, then dropped his arm, stepped back, and gestured toward the exit, like a doorman granting passage to someone who had earned it. Have a good night. Nadine walked to her car, unlocked it with steady hands, sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked and the engine off for 90 seconds, cataloging the encounter in the precise format that her training required. Time, location, personnel, physical contact, implied threat, arm barrier, no direct contact with body, verbal statements, implied surveillance, territorial declaration, isolation awareness. She started the engine, drove to the apartment, updated the file, 12 days, and the building was telling her things it did not know it was telling her. Every refusal to follow its own written policies, every record that vanished without a trace, every employee who looked the other way because the alternative was becoming the next person standing in an empty corridor with a flashlight in their face. The meeting where everything changed for Celeste Marrin, the meeting she would later identify as the moment she stopped being the person Hattie Rollins had believed in, happened on a Tuesday in March, 11 years before Nadine Calloway walked into her hospital. Celeste was 31 then, director of nursing operations. 3 promotions in 9 years, each one earned through a combination of clinical competence and the particular brand of institutional intelligence that recognized which battles to fight and which to absorb. She had learned the hospital's language, not just the medical terminology, but the political vocabulary, the grammar of boardroom dynamics, the syntax of ambition dressed as service. The meeting was with Dr. Franklin Webb, the then CEO, in his office on the 7th floor. Wood paneling, framed degrees, the view of the Texas Medical Center skyline that every hospital executive's office seemed contractually obligated to feature. "We have a situation," Webb had said. He was a large man with the particular softness of someone who had been powerful long enough to stop needing to demonstrate it physically. Post-surgical complication. Patient deceased. Family is asking questions. The file he slid across the desk contained 6 pages. A 67-year-old man, routine knee replacement. Post-op infection that escalated to sepsis. Dead within 72 hours of discharge. The chart showed standard antibiotic protocols followed. The patient's family disagreed. They said the discharge was premature, that their father had reported worsening symptoms during his final hours in the hospital, that a nurse on the evening shift had noted elevated white blood cell counts, but had been instructed not to delay the discharge because the bed was needed. Celeste read the file, read it again, found the note from the evening nurse. A handwritten addendum on the back of a progress sheet, the kind of documentation that existed precisely because the electronic record had been locked before the nurse could enter it. The nurse documented concerns that were not entered into the EHR, Celeste said, if the family obtains this during discovery, which is why that note needs to be contextualized. Webb's voice did not change, did not harden, did not soften. It maintained the exact tonality of someone presenting an administrative option rather than requesting the destruction of evidence. The nurse was on probation for tardiness. Her observations could be characterized as unreliable. The note could be filed as an outlier rather than a contributing document. Celeste sat in the chair across from the CEO of the hospital, where she had been given a stethoscope by a woman who said, "Heal first." She held a file that described how a man had died because a bed was more valuable than his white blood cell count. And she was being asked, not ordered, not threatened, just asked, in the gentle imperative of institutional power, to make the problem disappear by discrediting the one person who had tried to sound the alarm. She could have refused, could have walked out, could have taken the file to risk management and demanded an incident review, could have called the Texas Medical Board, could have done any of the things that the person she had been at 20, hungry, principled, holding Hattie's stethoscope like a promise, would have done without hesitation. Instead, she asked, "What happens to the nurse?" "She resigns, voluntarily, with a letter of reference that ensures she finds employment elsewhere. She's young. She'll recover." Celeste closed the file, set it on the desk, nodded, one nod. That was all it took. One small downward motion of the chin, and the note was filed as an outlier, and the nurse resigned voluntarily, and the family settled for an amount that would not appear in public records, and the bed was available for the next patient by Friday morning. And Celeste Marrin, who had arrived at this hospital with $47 and a community college transcript and a stethoscope given in kindness, learned that power could protect you from ever being vulnerable again. That the distance between poverty and control was measured not in years, but in the number of files you were willing to close without reading the last page. She never spoke to Hattie about that meeting, but Hattie noticed the change, the way Celeste stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria with the nurses, started eating in the administrative dining room, the way her voice, which had once carried the warmth of someone who remembered being hungry, began to carry the temperature of someone who had decided that being cold was the price of never being hungry again. "You're climbing, baby," Hattie had said to her one afternoon in the corridor, 6 months after the meeting. "But you're climbing with your eyes closed, and that's how people fall." Celeste had smiled, thanked her, walked away, and filed the advice in the same mental drawer where she kept the stethoscope, valued, remembered, and never used again. The confrontation with Dr. Selden happened in the scrub room. Day 15. Nadine had been reassigned to the pre-op area for the second consecutive week. No OR rotation, no surgical cases, no opportunity to observe the procedures being performed or the outcomes being recorded. She was, in every functional sense, being kept away from the operating rooms, which made it unusual when the charge nurse paged her at 1:45 p.m. and told her to report to Suite 3 for an emergency appendectomy assist, a last-minute substitution, because the assigned scrub nurse had called in sick and the backup was already committed to a case in Suite 7. Nadine scrubbed in, followed the protocol exactly, 10-minute surgical hand wash, gown and glove per hospital SOP, entered the OR through the correct door, positioned herself at the instrument table without disrupting the sterile field. Dr. Selden was already gowned and positioned at the table. She did not look up when Nadine entered, did not acknowledge her presence, simply continued her preoperative prep. Bovie check, cautery settings, a quiet conversation with the anesthesiologist about the patient's blood pressure trend, as if the nurse who had just entered her operating room were part of the equipment rather than the team. The surgery was routine. Inflamed appendix, no perforation, standard laparoscopic approach. Nadine anticipated instrument requests, maintained the count board with precision, managed the suction without being asked. Competent work, invisible work, the kind of work that becomes visible only when it is done poorly. The problem came during closure. Selden was suturing the trocar incision when the pulse oximeter alarmed, oxygen saturation dropping from 97 to 91, a rapid decline that could indicate bronchospasm, a mucus plug, or, in the worst case, a reaction to the anesthetic. "Sat's dropping," the anesthesiologist announced. 91, 90, 89. Nadine reached for the ambu bag, the manual ventilation device kept on the anesthesia cart for exactly this scenario. Her hand closed around the handle at the same moment, Doctor. Selden looked up from the incision. "Did I ask you to touch that?" The question froze the room. The anesthesiologist stopped adjusting the ventilator. The circulating nurse paused mid-step. Selden's eyes, visible above her surgical mask, locked on Nadine with the specific intensity of someone who had been given an opportunity to exercise authority and intended to use it. "The patient's saturation is 88, Doctor." "I am aware of the patient's saturation. I did not authorize you to intervene on the airway. That is Dr. Pham's role." She turned to the anesthesiologist. "Dr. Pham, handle your patient." Dr. Pham, mid-30s, already reaching for the bag that Nadine had tried to access, nodded quickly and began manual ventilation. The saturation stabilized within 40 seconds. 89, 90, 92. Crisis averted. But the correction had been made, the hierarchy had been enforced, and in the 6 seconds between Nadine reaching for the ambu bag and Dr. Selden's reprimand, the room had watched a nurse be disciplined for attempting to help a patient whose oxygen was falling. After closure, in the scrub room, Selden removed her gown with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 20,000 times. She dropped it into the linen bin without looking, turned on the water, and then, without warning, without preamble, reached across the sink and slapped the back of Nadine's hand with an open palm. Not hard enough to injure, not soft enough to dismiss. The precise middle ground of physical contact that communicates contempt while maintaining the deniability of an accident. A hand that happened to make contact with another hand in a small space. My OR, my airway decisions, my team. Selden's voice was low, private, the volume reserved for conversations that do not get repeated. You are a 12-week temp. You do not reach. You do not initiate. You do not touch equipment that is not in your scope unless I specifically tell you to. Do you understand? Nadine looked at the back of her hand. A red mark was forming. Not a bruise, not yet, but the beginning of one. The skin stung with the particular heat of a slap delivered by someone who wanted you to feel it tomorrow. I understand. Good. Selden turned off the water, dried her hands on a disposable towel, walked out of the scrub room without another word. Nadine stood at the sink for 60 seconds after Selden left. She ran cold water over the back of her hand, watched the red mark pulse with her heartbeat. And then she did something that would have confused anyone watching. She closed her eyes, took 3 measured breaths, and mentally rehearsed a sequence that had nothing to do with surgical nursing. She was reviewing the chain of custody requirements for physical evidence in federal investigations. Bruise documentation, photograph within 2 hours for initial coloration, again at 24 hours for full development, again at 48 hours for pattern confirmation. Chain of custody, date, time, photographer identity, storage location, access log. She photographed the back of her hand with her personal phone, time-stamped, geotagged, stored in the encrypted file. Then she returned to work, finished her shift, drove to the apartment, updated the file. Because a 12-week travel nurse would not know the chain of custody requirements for federal evidence, would not photograph a slap mark with the clinical detachment of someone following procedure rather than reacting to injury, would not file the incident using terminology drawn from the Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General's Evidence Preservation Manual. But Nadine Calloway was not a 12-week travel nurse, and the evidence she was collecting was not for human resources. The supply discrepancy appeared on day 18. Nadine arrived for her shift at 6:45 a.m. and found Lazenby waiting at the nursing station with a clipboard and the expression of someone who had been constructing a trap and was now ready to spring it. You logged out 14 pairs of size 7 sterile gloves from the supply room on Tuesday. Inventory shows only 8 returned to stock, 6 pairs unaccounted for. I logged out 8 pairs, not 14. The log says 14. He turned the clipboard toward her. There, in handwriting that approximated hers, but did not match it, the slant was wrong, the crossbars on the 7s were straight where hers were angled, was an entry showing 14 pairs checked out at 11:20 a.m. on Tuesday under her name. That's not my handwriting. It's your name, your shift, your access code. Someone used my access code to log a false entry. That log is not mine. Lazenby studied her with the patience of someone who had done this before, manufactured a discrepancy, waited for the denial, and then used the denial itself as evidence of character rather than evidence of truth. I'm writing this up. Inventory control violation. One more incident and we escalate to HR. He made a note on the clipboard, walked away. 20 minutes later, Nadine was summoned to the HR office on the second floor. She had never been to the second floor. It was administrative territory, carpeted, quiet, populated by people who wore business casual instead of scrubs and carried laptops instead of stethoscopes. The door to the Employee Relations Coordinator's office was open. Inside, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and a desktop nameplate sat behind a desk covered in file folders. "Close the door, please." The coordinator did not look up immediately. She was reading a document, the same write-up Lazenby had just completed, already printed, already signed, already in the HR file system. The speed of it was the message. The machinery of consequences operated faster for some employees than for others. I want to be clear that this is a preliminary conversation, not a disciplinary action. The tone was the one HR professionals use when they are conducting a disciplinary action and calling it something else. "Mr. Lazenby has documented a supply discrepancy associated with your access credentials. The hospital takes inventory integrity very seriously, particularly in the surgical department. The log entry is not mine. The handwriting does not match my handwriting. I can provide a sample for comparison." The coordinator wrote something on her notepad, did not respond to the offer. "We are placing a notation in your temporary personnel file. If there are no further incidents, the notation will be removed at the end of your contract. If there are further incidents..." She let the sentence hang, completing itself with institutional gravity. "I understand." "Good. You may return to your floor." Nadine returned to 4, made the coffee she had abandoned, and understood with crystalline clarity that the trap was not a single event. It was a system. Consent form discrepancies covered by silent EHR overwrites. Billing fraud enabled by a compliance officer who filed reports in a locked cabinet. Staff who asked questions removed from rotation. Staff who persisted framed for inventory violations that existed only on doctored logs. Each component made the others possible. Remove one, and the rest would adapt. The organism had been surviving for years, maybe longer, by metabolizing threats the way the body metabolizes pathogens: identify, isolate, neutralize. She was being identified now. Isolation had begun with the OR rotation removal. Neutralization would come through the accumulation of write-ups, inventory discrepancy, insubordination, scope of practice violation, until the paper trail justified what had been decided before she arrived, that she did not belong here, and that the systems of removal were simply documentation catching up to institutional consensus. The first time Nadine saw Dr. Elias Thorne, he was standing in the 4th-floor observation gallery, a glass-enclosed balcony that overlooked suites 3 and 4 through angled windows, designed to give medical students and administrators a view of the surgical field without contaminating the sterile environment. She noticed him because nobody else used the gallery. In 3 weeks, she had never seen another person in that space. It was a relic of the hospital's teaching ambitions, a feature built for a residency program that Callaway Memorial had applied for and never received, leaving the gallery as an architectural ghost, a room with a purpose that no longer existed. But Thorne used it, stood at the glass with his arms folded, watching. Not watching the surgery, watching the people performing the surgery. His eyes tracked movements with the detached attention of someone evaluating performance rather than learning technique. He was tall, late 50s, silver at the temples, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than a month of travel nursing wages, Vice President of Medical Affairs. Major shareholder, 28% of the hospital's operating entity, according to public filings. And, according to Tomas, The man who had been waiting for Celeste Marrin to make a mistake, catastrophic enough to justify removing her from the CEO position he believed he deserved. "He watches," Tomas said quietly during a supply restock. "Every week, different days, never announces, just appears in the gallery and stands there. Selden hates it. Lazenby pretends he doesn't notice. Celeste." He paused, chose his words. "Celeste performs. When she knows he's watching, she's in the OR more, attending more cases, making sure every surgery goes perfectly, because the one that doesn't, that's the one he's waiting for." Nadine filed the information. Another variable, another pressure point. A hospital where the CEO was being watched by a rival who wanted her job, which meant the CEO had additional incentive to ensure that surgical outcomes looked perfect on paper, even when they were not perfect in practice. The billing fraud was not just about money, it was about metrics, about making the hospital look like a center of excellence, when the reality was a department where consent forms were wrong, audit trails were missing, travel nurses were excluded from operating rooms based on race, and the chief of surgery struck subordinates in scrub rooms. And somewhere above it all, in the glass gallery, a man in a charcoal suit watched and waited for the collapse he was certain was coming. Day 22 brought the case that would change everything. The patient was Robert Gaines, 63 years old, former vice president of a Houston energy company, major donor. His family foundation had contributed $2.4 million to Callaway Memorial's cardiac wing renovation, which explained why his triple coronary bypass was scheduled for Suite 1, the hospital's showcase operating room, with Dr. Selden personally performing and Celeste Marrin observing. CEOs did not typically observe surgeries. Their time was consumed by board meetings, donor relations, regulatory compliance, the administrative machinery that kept 400 beds occupied, and Medicare payments flowing. But Robert Gaines was not a typical patient. His wife sat on the hospital's fundraising committee. His son-in-law was a state legislator. His surgery was not just a medical procedure. It was a performance, a demonstration that Callaway Memorial could deliver world-class cardiac care to the kind of patient whose satisfaction generated additional donations and political goodwill. Celeste arrived at the observation area outside Suite 1 at 7:50 a.m., wearing her white lab coat over a tailored dress. The CEO costume that communicated, "I could be clinical if I chose to, but I choose to lead instead." She carried a tablet showing Gaines's case file, his donation history, and a talking points document she would use when she spoke to the family after the procedure. Nadine was not assigned to the case. She was scheduled for pre-op on the opposite side of the floor. But the OR roster had changed at 6:15 a.m. The circulating nurse for Suite 1 had called in with a family emergency, and the backup circulator was already committed. The charge nurse had paged Nadine at 6:20. "Suite 1, Gaines CABG, circulate. You're the only one available." Nadine acknowledged. Scrubbed in. Took her position at the circulating station, responsible for managing supplies, documentation, and communication between the sterile field and the outside world. The job nobody noticed unless something went wrong. She entered the OR at 7:40 a.m. Dr. Selden was already scrubbing. Tomas was setting instruments. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Warren Pham, was reviewing drug calculations on his cart. Everything proceeding according to protocol. Then Celeste walked in, not into the observation area, into the operating room itself, through the main door, past the sterile boundary line, wearing her lab coat and her tablet and her street shoes. Street shoes in a sterile operating room, a contamination protocol violation that would have resulted in immediate removal of any other person in the building. "I want to be present for the first incision. Mr. Gaines's family specifically requested administrative oversight during the procedure." She said it to no one in particular, the way CEOs speak when they are issuing declarations rather than requesting permission. Dr. Selden's eyes flickered. Annoyance, quickly suppressed, but she did not object. Dr. Pham stared at Celeste's shoes and said nothing. Tomas kept his eyes on the instruments. Nobody said what everyone was thinking. The CEO was standing in a sterile operating room in non-sterile attire during an active surgical case. It was a violation of the hospital's own infection control policy. Section 4.2, Surgical Attire Standards. All personnel entering active surgical suites must wear facility-approved scrub attire, shoe covers, and hair covering. No exceptions. No exceptions. Except for the exception that had just walked through the door carrying a tablet and a donor's goodwill. Celeste saw Nadine for the first time since the corridor confrontation 6 days earlier. The recognition was immediate, a tightening around the jaw, a fractional narrowing of the eyes, the micro-expression of someone encountering a problem they thought they had already delegated to someone else. "Why is she in my OR?" Celeste directed the question at Lazenby, who was standing in the doorway with the schedule clipboard he carried the way other people carried security blankets. "Substitution," Wilson called out. "She's the only circulator available." "Find someone else." "There is no one else. Suite 7 has our backup. Suite 3 starts at 8:30. Every qualified circulator is committed." Lazenby delivered the information with the flat affect of someone presenting facts he could not change to a person who did not accept that facts were unchangeable. Celeste stared at Nadine across the OR. 10 feet of sterile field and surgical equipment between them. The monitor bank glowed with Robert Gaines's baseline vitals, heart rate 68, blood pressure 132/78, oxygen saturation 99%. A healthy man about to have his chest opened. Fine. The word carried the temperature of a decision that had been accepted but not forgiven. Celeste turned back to her tablet, began reviewing the talking points she would deliver to the Gaines family after the procedure, post-operative care timeline, expected recovery milestones, the carefully worded language that transformed a medical event into a fundraising conversation. Nadine documented the violation on the circulating nurse's log, time of entry, identity, attire noted, and continued her work. The surgery began. First incision at 8:03 a.m. Standard sternotomy approach. Dr. Selden working with the controlled precision that made her the most expensive surgeon in the building. Everything proceeding normally. Until it wasn't. The crash happened at 8:47 a.m. Dr. Pham noticed it first. A subtle change in the arterial line waveform, the kind of variation that experienced anesthesiologists recognize before the monitor's alarm, because they have spent years watching the rhythmic dance of blood pressure and heart rate and know when the dance is about to stop. Pressures dropping, systolic 72, heart rate climbing, 120, 125. Selden looked up from the surgical field. Her hands paused, gloved, bloodied, holding a needle driver and a length of suture, as she processed what the numbers meant. In a coronary bypass, pressure drops during certain phases were expected. But this drop was steep, sudden, and accompanied by a heart rate that suggested the body was compensating for something it should not have to compensate for. Fluids wide open. Push phenylephrine. Selden's voice was steady, clinical, the voice of a surgeon who had managed intraoperative crises before and knew that tone set the room's temperature. Dr. Pham pushed the vasopressor. The blood pressure responded, briefly. Systolic climbed to 78, held for 12 seconds, then began falling again, 74, 70, 66. "He's tamponading." Selden said it quietly, but the word carried through the room the way certain medical terms do, not because they are loud, but because they change the air. Cardiac tamponade. Blood accumulating in the pericardial sac, compressing the heart, preventing it from filling. A complication that, if not treated within minutes, was fatal. The monitor alarmed. A steady, insistent tone that translated medical data into human urgency. This patient is dying. Celeste Marrin, who had been standing near the observation window with her tablet, stepped forward, not toward the door, not toward the phone to call for additional help, toward the patient, toward the surgical field, toward the crisis. "What's happening? What's wrong?" Her voice broke the clinical tone of the room, too loud, too fast, the rhythm of someone experiencing panic rather than managing it. "This is Robert Gaines. This cannot. His family is in the waiting room. We cannot lose this patient. Celeste, I need you to step back. Selden did not look up. Her hands were moving, probing the pericardium, looking for the source of the bleeding. His wife is on our fundraising committee. His son-in-law is in the legislature. If this patient dies on this table, Celeste, step back. But Celeste did not step back. She stepped forward, toward the crash cart where Nadine was already positioning the emergency pericardiocentesis tray, the kit used to drain blood from the sac surrounding the heart. It was the next step in the protocol. Selden would need it within seconds. Nadine's hands were on the tray when Celeste reached her. Get away from that. You're not qualified to. Celeste's hand closed on Nadine's upper arm and shoved. Not a push, not a nudge, a shove. The kind of physical contact that uses body weight and intent, that sends a 140-pound woman sideways into the crash cart's frame with enough force to knock the defibrillator paddles loose from their cradle. The paddles hit the floor. The tray tilted. A sterile package slid off the edge and landed on the tile. Nadine caught herself on the cart's handle. Her hip struck the metal corner, a sharp, concentrated pain that would leave a bruise the size of a fist, and for 1 second, the room froze. Celeste standing over her, hand still extended from the shove, chest heaving, eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with medicine, and everything to do with what this patient's death would mean for her career, her board seat, her carefully constructed narrative of excellence. Selden at the table, hands inside a man's open chest, watching the scene at the crash cart with an expression that mixed surgical urgency with institutional horror. The chief of surgery watching the CEO assault a nurse during a code. Tomas at the instrument table, motionless, gripping a retractor with both hands, his face showing the 18 years of accumulated institutional knowledge that told him exactly what was happening and exactly how powerless he was to stop it. And Dr. Pham at the anesthesia station, reading a blood pressure that now showed systolic 54. He has minutes, Pham said. Somebody drain that pericardium or we lose him. Selden's hands were occupied. She could not reach the tray. She could not step away from the surgical field without risking hemorrhage at the anastomosis site she was suturing when the crash began. Celeste stood between the crash cart and the table, physically blocking the space, her breathing rapid, her face showing the particular collapse that happens when someone who has spent years controlling institutional systems encounters a situation that institutional authority cannot fix. The monitor's alarm tone shifted from steady to urgent. Systolic 50, 48, and Nadine Calloway, travel nurse, 12-week temp, the woman who had been excluded from OR rotations, grabbed by an OR manager, slapped by a chief of surgery, shoved by a CEO, and told repeatedly that she was not qualified to touch anything in this room. Straightened from where the shove had sent her, stepped past Celeste without a word, picked up the pericardiocentesis tray, and positioned it on the patient's right side. I need a needle, 18 gauge, spinal length, and ultrasound guidance. Her voice was not loud, was not urgent, was not the voice of someone performing outside their scope of practice. It was the voice of someone returning to a scope of practice they had never actually left, calm, precise, carrying the particular authority of someone who has performed this procedure not once or twice but dozens of times, in trauma bays and operating rooms and field hospitals, where the difference between a patient living and dying was measured in the 60 seconds between identification and intervention. Selden looked up from the surgical field, stared, processed. Do it, she said. Nadine palpated the subxiphoid space, located the landmark, the point between the xiphoid process and the left costal margin where the needle would enter the pericardial sac without puncturing the heart or lung. Applied the ultrasound probe with her left hand. Guided the needle with her right. 18 gauge, angle 45 degrees. Depth calculated by the image on the ultrasound screen. 2 centimeters of fluid compressing the right ventricle, enough to kill a man in minutes. The needle entered. She aspirated. Dark blood, not arterial red, not venous blue, but the particular color of blood that has been sitting in a space where blood does not belong, filled the syringe. 10 cubic centimeters, 20, 30. The monitor responded before anyone could speak. Systolic 54, 58, 62. Heart rate decelerating from 140 to 120. The tamponade releasing. The heart expanding. The patient returning from the edge of a death that had been less than 2 minutes away. Selden watched the numbers climb. Looked at Nadine's hands. Steady. Positioned with a precision that spoke of formal training, not improvisation. Looked at the ultrasound image showing the needle tip perfectly placed within the pericardial space, aspirating fluid with the controlled technique of someone who had been taught this procedure by attending physicians, not YouTube videos. "Who are you?" Selden said. The question was not hostile. It was bewildered. The specific bewilderment of an expert recognizing expertise in someone she had been told had none. Nadine did not answer. She was monitoring the aspiration, watching the ultrasound, counting the volume of blood she was removing to ensure she did not overdrain and cause the opposite problem. Professional focus, clinical concentration, the tunnel vision of someone saving a life. But the question hung in the air, unanswered, resonating, carrying a weight that everyone in the room could feel but only one person fully understood. From the observation gallery, behind the angled glass that overlooked Suite 1, Dr. Elias Thorne stood with his phone in his hand. He had been recording for 3 minutes and 14 seconds. His expression was unreadable, the face of a man who had been waiting for a catastrophe and had instead witnessed something far more interesting. A nurse who could perform a pericardiocentesis with trauma surgeon precision. A CEO who had shoved that nurse in front of an entire surgical team. And a recording that now existed on a device that was not part of the hospital's security system, not subject to its retention policies, and not under the control of anyone in the building except the man who intended to use it. He lowered the phone, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and continued watching, with the patience of someone who understood that the most valuable thing in any institution was information that the institution did not know you possessed. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Part 2 will reveal exactly who Nadine Calloway really is, and nothing at Callaway Memorial will ever be the same. The surgery finished at 11:18 a.m. Robert Gaines was alive, stabilized, transferred to cardiac ICU, prognosis upgraded from critical to guarded, Dr. Selden closed without further incident. The pericardial drain remained in place, monitored every 15 minutes per post-operative protocol. Nobody spoke about what had happened. Not Selden, who stripped her gown in the scrub room and left without making eye contact with anyone. Not Dr. Pham, who documented the intraoperative crisis in the anesthesia record with the clinical detachment of someone who understood that the chart was now a legal document. Not Tomas, who cleaned the instrument trays with the careful thoroughness of a man who had witnessed something that confirmed what 18 years of observation had suggested, that this hospital was held together by the silence of people who knew what was wrong and the labor of people who were punished for fixing it. Celeste Marrin left the OR at 8:53 a.m., 6 minutes after the crisis began, 1 minute after Nadine's intervention stabilized the patient. She walked directly to the elevator bank, rode to 7, entered her office, and closed the door. She did not speak to the surgical team, did not check on the patient, did not file an incident report about the intraoperative emergency that had nearly killed a major donor on her operating table. And she did not, in any formal or informal capacity, address the fact that she had physically shoved a nurse during an active code, in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, in front of a man in the observation gallery whose phone now contained 3 minutes and 14 seconds of footage that could end her career. Tomas found Nadine in the break room at 11:40. She was sitting alone at the table by the window, the one nobody used because the view faced the loading dock and the dumpster corral. Her scrubs had a smudge of dried blood on the left sleeve from the aspiration. Her hip ached where the crash cart corner had caught her. She was holding a paper cup of water and staring at the wall. He sat across from her. Did not speak for a full minute, just sat with the patient stillness of a man who had learned that presence was sometimes worth more than words. "In 18 years, he finally said, I have never seen a nurse do what you just did." She looked at him. His eyes were careful, not suspicious exactly, but questioning. the face of someone reevaluating what they thought they knew. It needed to be done. Pericardiocentesis is not a nursing procedure, not at any hospital, not in any state. That's a physician intervention, emergency medicine, cardiology, surgery. Ultrasound guided, in the middle of an open chest bypass, while the patient was crashing, and the CEO was... He stopped, shook his head. Who taught you to do that? I've worked in trauma settings. He studied her. The answer was not wrong. It was possible, narrowly, that a nurse with extensive trauma experience might have observed the procedure enough times to replicate it under crisis conditions. But possible and plausible were different things, and Tomas was a man who had spent 18 years noticing differences. The ultrasound guidance, the needle angle, the aspiration volume management. That was not observation, that was training. He paused. I don't need to know what kind of training, but I need you to know that other people in that room are going to ask the same question, and not all of them will let you change the subject. She nodded, set down the paper cup. Tomas, how long have you been documenting what happens in this hospital? His expression shifted, a micro movement around the eyes, the particular look of someone who has been carrying a secret that just got recognized by a stranger. He did not answer the question, but his silence was its own form of answer. I keep records, he said carefully. Dates, times, things I see. I don't know why. Maybe because nobody else does. Maybe because 18 years is a long time to watch things go wrong and pretend they're going right. Those records matter. They're in a notebook in my locker, handwritten, 3 years of entries. He looked at the table. I've never shown them to anyone. You might want to make a copy, store it somewhere outside the building. He looked up, met her eyes. Something passed between them. Not trust exactly, but the tentative beginning of it. The recognition that two people documenting the same pattern from different positions might, at some point, need to combine what they knew. Be careful, he said, stood, walked back to the OR floor without another word. On the 4th floor, Nadine returned to the nursing station, sat down, poured a cup of coffee from the communal pot, drank it. Her hands were steady. They had been steady during the pericardiocentesis, steady while positioning the needle, steady while Celeste Marrin's handprint was still warm on her upper arm. She reached for her phone, opened the encrypted messaging application she used for communications that could not travel through hospital networks, typed 3 words to a contact identified only by a case number. Timeline is accelerating. The response came in 9 seconds. Understood. Hold position. Subpoena is drafted. She deleted the exchange, locked the phone, finished the coffee. Above her, on the 7th floor, Celeste Marrin sat in her office with the lights off, staring at the framed photograph on her credenza. A younger version of herself, 20 years old, standing in a hallway that no longer existed, holding a stethoscope that someone had pressed into her hands with 3 words she could no longer hear without flinching. Heal first. Climb later. She had climbed. She had climbed so far and so fast that the ground had disappeared beneath her. And now, in the dark office on the 7th floor, with the taste of adrenaline still metallic in her mouth, and the image of a travel nurse performing a cardiac procedure with surgical precision burning behind her eyes, Celeste Marrin realized that the ground was not gone. It was coming back up, and it was coming fast. Coming. The subpoena arrived on a Thursday. Not at the hospital, not by process server walking through the lobby past the tarnished brass plaque and the water feature trickling its permanent soundtrack of institutional calm. The sealed federal subpoena, issued by the United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas, signed by Magistrate Judge Rosa Delgado, case number 4:26-CR-0087, was delivered to the offices of Callaway Memorial's outside counsel at 9:14 a.m. by a deputy U.S. Marshal who handed the envelope to a paralegal, signed the confirmation of service, and left without explaining what was inside. Nadine did not know the subpoena had arrived. That was by design. The investigation operated on compartmentalized timelines. Field agents collected evidence, analysts built the case architecture, and the Assistant United States Attorney controlled the legal instruments. Nadine's role was to be inside the building when the subpoena's demands began generating responses, to watch who destroyed what, to document which filing cabinets emptied first. What she did know, by the end of day 23, was that something had changed. The change was atmospheric. Subtle, the way barometric pressure is subtle. Invisible, but felt in the joints, in the sinuses, in the particular tightness that settles behind the eyes before a storm. Lazenby walked the corridors with his clipboard held tighter than usual, his inspection stops shorter, his conversations with the charge nurse conducted in whispers that stopped when Nadine came within earshot. Gannon appeared on the 4th floor twice in a single morning. Unusual for a compliance officer whose office was on 2 and whose typical rotation brought her to surgical services once a week. She carried a banker's box both times. Both times the box went into Lazenby's office and did not come out. And Celeste Marrin, who had not been seen on the surgical floor since the OR incident, appeared at 3:22 p.m. in the corridor outside the medical records department. She was with a man Nadine had not seen before. 50s, gray suit, leather briefcase, the groomed caution of outside legal counsel. They spoke for 4 minutes. Celeste's face showed the controlled blankness of someone receiving information she had prepared for but hoped would not arrive. Nadine was restocking the linen cart in the adjacent hallway, close enough to observe, far enough to be unremarkable. She noted the time, the attorney's description, the direction Celeste walked afterward, not toward her office on 7, but toward the compliance suite on 2, moving with the particular urgency of someone who has just learned that the walls are no longer as thick as she thought. That evening, in the studio apartment, Nadine opened the encrypted channel and typed, "Institutional response visible. Records movement observed. Banker's boxes to OR manager's office, 2 trips. Compliance officer. Outside counsel on site. Met with CEO at 15:22. Atmosphere consistent with subpoena receipt." The response came in 40 seconds. Confirmed. Subpoena served 0914. Document preservation order attached. Any destruction is obstruction. 18 U.S.C. Section 1519. Continue documenting. Do not intervene. Do not intervene. The hardest instruction in undercover work. Watch them shred. Watch them overwrite. Watch the evidence you have spent weeks collecting get carried out in boxes and buried in locked offices, and do nothing, because the act of destruction was itself evidence, and because intervening would reveal the investigation before the net was wide enough to catch everyone it needed to catch. She closed the channel, encrypted the drive, set the bag by the door, and thought about Tomas in his locker on 4, with 3 years of handwritten observations in a notebook that nobody had asked to see. She had told him to make a copy. She hoped he had listened. The hospital's internal surveillance system recorded continuously across 114 cameras distributed throughout the facility. The footage was stored on servers maintained by the IT department, with a default retention period of 90 days before automatic overwrite. Access to live feeds was restricted to security personnel. Access to archived footage required a written request approved by the Chief Security Officer, Boyd Strattan, which meant that footage of the OR incident, Celeste Marrin shoving a nurse during an active cardiac emergency, was stored on a server controlled by a man who reported directly to the CEO who had done the shoving. Nadine had anticipated this. On the evening of the OR incident, she had drafted a formal request to the hospital's risk management department for preservation of surveillance footage from Suite 1, the corridor outside Suite 1, and the observation gallery, citing the date, the time window of 7:40 a.m. to 9 a.m., and the incident description. Intraoperative emergency involving physical contact between non-clinical personnel and nursing staff during active patient code. She had filed the request through the hospital's internal system at 6:11 p.m., creating an electronic timestamp that the IT department could not retroactively alter without generating a server-side audit log that the federal investigation already had the tools to capture. 2 days later, the response came from risk management. Your request has been received and is under review. Pursuant to Hospital Policy Section 22, subsection D, footage preservation requests require authorization from the Chief Security Officer and the Chief Administrative Officer. Your request has been forwarded to the appropriate parties. The appropriate parties were Strattan and Celeste. The people who had the most to lose from the footage being preserved were now responsible for deciding whether to preserve it. Nadine documented the response, added it to the file, and noted, with the clinical precision of someone who had seen this pattern before, that the hospital was now on record having received a preservation request, which meant that any subsequent deletion of the footage would constitute spoliation of evidence, a fact that federal prosecutors would use with considerable enthusiasm when the case reached court. Mama Hattie arrived on day 25. She came through the main entrance at 10 a.m., moving with the deliberate pace of a woman whose body was 73, but whose presence still commanded the kind of attention that had nothing to do with speed. She wore a navy dress with a white collar, low-heeled shoes, and a visitor badge she had clipped to her lapel, with the practiced familiarity of someone who had worn identification in this building for 4 decades. Hattie Rollins, retired head nurse, 41 years at Callaway Memorial. She had trained half the nursing staff currently on the floor, had held the hands of patients who died and the hands of doctors who let them, had watched 3 CEOs come and go, each one arriving with promises and leaving with excuses. She was here because she still visited the cardiac ward every month, brought magazines, checked on long-term patients, sat with families who needed someone to sit with them. The hospital had given her emeritus privileges as a retirement gesture, which meant she could badge into clinical areas, use the staff cafeteria, and walk the corridors without being stopped by security. Nobody stopped Hattie Rollins, not even Strattan, who watched her pass through the lobby with the uncomfortable deference of a man who recognized authority that did not come from a badge or a title, but from something older and less negotiable. She found Nadine at the nursing station on 4. The recognition was immediate. Hattie stopped walking. Her hand went to the lanyard around her neck, a gesture Nadine had seen once before, 20 years ago, in a kitchen that smelled like Sunday cooking and lavender soap, when a woman with calloused hands had pressed a stethoscope into the hands of a hungry girl and told her to heal first. "Miss Calloway." Hattie's voice was steady, but her eyes were not. They moved across Nadine's face with the particular intensity of someone confirming a memory against a present reality. "I didn't know you were—" She caught herself, glanced at the corridor, at the open doors, at the building that was always listening. "Working here. 12-week contract." Nadine kept her voice neutral, professional, the voice of a travel nurse meeting a retired staff member, nothing more. But Hattie's hand reached across the nursing station counter and closed around Nadine's wrist, gently, briefly, the way you hold someone when you want them to know you see them but cannot say what you see. "Your grandmother would be proud." 4 words, barely above a whisper. Then she released the wrist, straightened, and walked toward the cardiac ward, carrying her stack of magazines as if nothing had happened. Tomas, who had been changing an IV bag 3 beds away, watched the exchange without comment. But his eyes lingered on the space where Hattie's hand had held Nadine's wrist, the gesture of someone who did not treat travel nurses with that kind of reverence, the gesture of someone who knew a different name for the woman in the blue scrubs. Later that afternoon, Hattie found Nadine in the staff break room. The room was empty, 2:30 p.m., the dead hour between shift changes when the floor belonged to machines and monitors. Hattie sat across from her, set her purse on the table, folded her hands with the composure of someone who had been carrying a question for 25 days and had decided that today was the day to ask it. "How bad is it?" Nadine studied the woman who had been her grandmother's closest friend for 30 years, the woman who had placed a stethoscope in a hungry girl's hands and accidentally created the person who was now destroying that girl's career. "Bad enough to be here." Hattie nodded, slowly. The nod of someone who already knew the answer and had asked the question only to hear it confirmed. She wasn't always this. Hattie's voice was quiet now, the volume reserved for truths that hurt to speak. "When she came here, Celeste, she was so hungry. Not just for food, for a chance. For someone to tell her she was worth something. I gave her that stethoscope because I saw what your grandmother saw in everyone. The possibility. The best version. She paused, looked at her hands. Hands that had started IVs in collapsed veins. Hands that had held Celeste Marrin's hands on a day when $47 was all the future a girl could afford. But that doesn't excuse what she became. And it doesn't protect what she's doing to this hospital. To the patients. To the name on that building. Hattie looked up. Your name. Hattie. I know why you're here. I don't need the details. I just need to know. Will it be fair? Will they look at what she did and not just who she is? That's what the process is designed for. Processes. Hattie smiled, the tired, knowing smile of a woman who had spent 41 years inside a process that protected the powerful and ground down everyone else. Processes are only as honest as the people running them. The people running this one are honest. Hattie studied her, then nodded once more, not the slow nod of confirmation, but the decisive nod of a woman who had made a choice. In the bottom drawer of my desk at home, there's a folder, blue, labeled Personal. It has 37 incident reports I filed between 2014 and 2021. Everyone was acknowledged by compliance. Not one generated an investigation. She stood, picked up her purse. If someone with the right authority asked me for that folder, I would give it to them. She walked to the door, stopped, turned back. Be careful with her. Cornered people do desperate things. And Celeste Marrin has been cornered before. She survived by becoming the thing that cornered her. She left. The break room hummed with the refrigerator's compressor and the fluorescent light's 60-cycle buzz. Nadine sat with cold coffee in a paper cup and the weight of a folder she could not yet ask for, filed by a woman who had spent 7 years documenting what a system refused to see. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, subscribe now. What happens next will change everything you thought you knew about Callaway Memorial. Day 28. The board met at 8 a.m., emergency session, called the previous evening by Dr. Elias Thorne, who had exercised his authority as the hospital's second-largest shareholder to invoke Article 9, Section 3 of the corporate bylaws, the provision that allowed any shareholder holding more than 15% of the operating entity to demand a special meeting of the board of directors with 48 hours' notice when circumstances presented material risk to the institution's operational integrity or fiduciary standing. Thorne had been patient. 23 days of patience since the OR incident. 23 days of the phone recording sitting in his jacket pocket like a loaded weapon, waiting for the moment when deploying it would cause maximum damage to Celeste and maximum benefit to himself. The moment arrived when outside counsel informed the board, via encrypted email at 4:47 p.m. on Wednesday, that the hospital had received a federal subpoena demanding production of all surgical billing records, consent forms, EHR audit logs, compliance reports, and internal communications related to Medicare claims submitted between January of the prior year and the present date. The subpoena cited the False Claims Act. The cover letter referenced an active investigation by the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General. Thorne read the email, made 2 phone calls, filed the Article 9 demand by 6 p.m., and arrived at the boardroom on the 8th floor the following morning, wearing the charcoal suit and the expression of a man who had been rehearsing this performance for years. The boardroom occupied the northeast corner of the building, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Texas Medical Center, a mahogany table long enough to seat 14, the kind of room where institutions made decisions that affected thousands of people while drinking coffee from porcelain cups with the hospital's logo printed in navy blue. 9 board members present. Celeste at the head of the table, flanked by Gannon and the outside counsel, a senior partner named Alden Cross, whose hourly rate exceeded what most of the nursing staff earned in a day. Thorne sat at the opposite end, alone, his phone face down on the table in front of him. The first 40 minutes were procedural. Cross outlined the subpoena's scope. Gannon presented the Compliance Department's response, a 14-page summary asserting that all billing practices conformed to CMS guidelines, that the hospital's EHR system maintained complete audit trails, and that no credible allegations of fraud had been received through internal channels. The summary was, in Nadine's case file, a document that contradicted itself on page 3, where it stated that 0 billing discrepancy reports were substantiated during the review period, a claim that was technically true only because every report filed had been closed as resolved by Gannon before investigation could begin. Thorne listened, did not interrupt, let the narrative build its own scaffolding before he dismantled it. At 8:43, he spoke for the first time. "I have a question about the OR incident on the 14th. The temperature in the room shifted. Celeste's fingers, which had been resting on the table, curled slightly, the involuntary contraction of someone bracing for impact. "What incident?" Board Chair Margaret Linden, early 70s, pearl earrings, the composed authority of someone who had chaired corporate boards for 3 decades, looked from Thorne to Celeste and back. "An intraoperative cardiac emergency during the Gaines bypass. A patient nearly died from tamponade. During the crisis, the CEO, who was present in the OR in non-sterile attire, in violation of Section 4.2 of our own infection control policy, physically shoved a nurse who was preparing the emergency intervention equipment." Silence. The kind of silence that is not absence of sound but presence of consequence. "That characterization is inaccurate," Celeste said. Her voice was level but her jaw was set, the mandibular tension of someone controlling what her face revealed while her body betrayed her. "I was present as administrative observer at the family's request. During the emergency, there was incidental physical contact as I attempted to clear the area. It was not a... I have the footage." Thorne said it the way someone places a card face up on a table. No dramatic gesture, no raised voice, just the flat statement of a fact that changed the arithmetic. He turned his phone face up, pressed play. 3 minutes and 14 seconds. The gallery's angle captured everything. Celeste's approach, her hand closing on Nadine's upper arm, the shove that sent a 140-pound woman into the crash cart hard enough to dislodge the defibrillator paddles. The audio was muffled by the glass, but Celeste's words were audible. "Get away from that. You're not qualified to..." And then the shove. And then Nadine straightening, picking up the pericardiocentesis tray, performing a cardiac procedure with the steady hands of someone who had done it many times before. The board watched in silence. Margaret Linden's hand moved to her mouth. 2 members leaned forward, reading the scene with the focused attention of people who understood that liability was unfolding in front of them in high definition. Celeste watched herself on the phone screen, watched the shove from an angle she had never seen. The external perspective that stripped away the internal narrative of panic and donor pressure and institutional stakes and revealed only what a jury would see. A CEO assaulting a nurse during a medical emergency. "I move to suspend the CEO pending a formal investigation," Thorne said, "on grounds of patient endangerment, assault of a staff member, and the pending federal subpoena that suggests material misrepresentation of our billing practices under her leadership." "You're using this to take my job." Celeste's voice cracked on the last word. Not loudly, not dramatically. The hairline fracture of someone whose composure had held for 22 years and was now showing the first visible fault line. "I'm using this to protect the institution," Thorne replied. His voice carried exactly the right amount of concern and exactly the wrong amount of sincerity. The calibrated performance of a man who wanted something and had found a righteous reason to take it. The board voted. 7-2. 7-2. Celeste Marrin was suspended from her duties as CEO effective immediately, pending investigation by an independent committee to be appointed within 72 hours. She stood, gathered her tablet and her notepad and the porcelain coffee cup with the Navy logo. walked to the door with the rigid posture of someone holding herself together by the architecture of her spine, rather than the conviction that she deserved to. At the door, she stopped, turned, looked at Thorne. "You recorded me, in a surgical suite, while a patient was coding. You stood there with your phone and you recorded, and you waited 23 days to show anyone." Her voice was not angry now. It was something worse. It was clear. "You didn't wait because you needed time. You waited because you wanted maximum damage. You wanted me gone, and you wanted the board to see me at my worst so they'd give you what you want." She paused. "The patient could have died while you were filming." Thorne said nothing, but his jaw tightened, and for one moment, brief, quickly suppressed, something moved behind his eyes that looked very much like the acknowledgement that she was right, and the decision that being right did not matter as much as being in charge. Celeste left the boardroom. The door closed behind her with the weighted finality of doors in rooms where careers end. The call came at 11:07 a.m. Nadine was in the supply room on 4, the same room where she had discovered the billing anomaly 3 weeks earlier, when her encrypted phone vibrated with the 3-pulse pattern that indicated a priority communication from her handler. "Green light, warrant signed, execution at 1400. A USA Reyes will be on site. Marshals at the service entrance. Your credentials are in the sealed packet at the field office. Courier en route to your location." She closed her eyes. 1400, 2 p.m., 3 hours from now. 3 hours to transition from the woman who stocked linen carts and endured bag checks to the woman whose name was on the building, whose badge said something very different from registered nurse, and whose authority to be in this hospital came not from a staffing agency, but from the United States Department of Health and Human Services. The courier arrived at 12:40. A woman in plain clothes, carrying a padded envelope marked with a case number and the seal of the HHS Office of Inspector General. She handed it to Nadine in the staff parking lot, Lot C, behind the loading dock, the lot where the hospital sorted people it considered less important, and left without speaking. Inside the envelope, her credentials. The gold badge, the credential card with her photograph and her real title, Special Agent, Office of Inspector General, Department of Health and Human Services. Her medical license, Texas Medical Board, MD, board certified in emergency medicine and trauma surgery. And the document that changed the geometry of everything, the Callaway Family Trust Charter, page 14, section 3, paragraph 2. Nadine Eloise Calloway, granddaughter of Harold and Lorraine Calloway, sole beneficiary and majority shareholder, holding 51% of the operating entity known as Callaway Memorial Medical Center, effective upon the death of the last surviving trustee. Her grandmother Lorraine had died 4 years ago. The trust had activated. The shares had transferred. And for 4 years, the hospital that bore her grandfather's name had been operated by people who did not know that the majority shareholder was watching from a distance, reading quarterly mortality reports forwarded by the trust administrator, growing increasingly alarmed by the numbers that did not match what a hospital of this size and patient population should be producing. 3 post-operative deaths flagged by CMS. Surgical complication rates 22% above the national average. And a pattern of Medicare claims that, when analyzed by the OIG's forensic accountants, showed systematic upcoding, billing for more expensive procedures than those actually performed, totaling an estimated $4.7 million over 3 fiscal years. That was when Nadine had made the call. Not to the board, not to the CEO, to the U.S. Attorney's Office, because the hospital her grandfather had built to heal people was instead hurting them. And the woman running it had turned the founder's legacy into a billing machine that generated revenue by inflating the suffering it was supposed to relieve. At 1:55 p.m., Nadine walked into the women's restroom on the 4th floor, locked the door, and changed. Removed the blue scrubs, folded them, placed them in the bag that had sat by her apartment door every morning for 28 days, zipper facing the wall, always within arm's reach. Put on the suit she had stored in the bottom of the duffel, dark navy, pressed, the clothes of someone who stood in front of federal judges and presented evidence that put people in prison. Clipped the gold badge to her belt, placed the credential card in her jacket pocket, looked at herself in the mirror and saw, for the first time in 4 weeks, the person she actually was. Not a travel nurse, not a temp, not the woman who had been grabbed and slapped and shoved and searched and written up and excluded and told, in every language the institution knew how to speak, that she did not belong here. She was Dr. Nadine Calloway, Special Agent, HHS Office of Inspector General, board-certified trauma surgeon, and the majority owner of the building she was standing in. She opened the restroom door and walked toward the 4th-floor corridor, where 4 deputy U.S. Marshals were already positioning at the stairwell exits, and AUSA Carmen Reyes was stepping off the service elevator carrying a federal search warrant endorsed by Judge Rosa Delgado 2 hours earlier. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the next 5 minutes are going to change every assumption you had about this woman. The execution of the warrant began at 2:04 p.m. AUSA Reyes, early 40s, dark hair pulled back, the composed intensity of a prosecutor who had tried 11 healthcare fraud cases and won 9, presented the warrant to the hospital's general counsel in the administrative suite on 7. The document authorized seizure of all electronic health records, billing submissions, compliance reports, internal communications, and surveillance footage related to Medicare claims at Callaway Memorial Medical Center for the specified period. Simultaneously, 2 OIG forensic analysts entered the IT department on the ground floor with a separate warrant for direct server access, bypassing the normal chain of custody that ran through Strattan's security office, ensuring that whatever footage remained on the surveillance servers would be captured before it could be deleted. And on the 4th floor, Nadine, Agent Calloway, walked into Dirk Lazenby's office for the last time. He was behind his desk, clipboard centered, pens aligned, the schedule printout on the wall trimmed to exact right angles. He looked up when the door opened and saw the woman he had grabbed by the forearm, framed for inventory theft, and excluded from surgical rotations, standing in his doorway in a Navy suit with a federal badge on her belt. He did not speak for 7 seconds. She counted. Dirk Lazenby, I'm Special Agent Nadine Calloway, HHS Office of Inspector General. I'm executing a federal search warrant for all records in this office related to surgical scheduling, supply chain documentation, and personnel actions. You are not under arrest. You are not required to answer questions. But any records you destroy, conceal, or alter from this moment forward will constitute obstruction of a federal investigation under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519. She set the warrant on his desk, next to the clipboard. Lazenby's face performed a sequence of expressions: confusion, recognition, calculation, and then the specific emptiness of someone who has been caught inside a machine he helped build and understands, suddenly, that the machine does not care about him any more than it cared about anyone else. I want a lawyer. That's your right. You may contact counsel at any time. In the meantime, please step away from the desk and do not touch any files, devices, or equipment in this office. He stood, walked to the doorway, stopped, turned. The supply log, the glove inventory write-up. That was... He did not finish the sentence. Did not need to. They both knew what it was. Documented, Nadine said. Everything is documented. In the scrub room outside Suite 3, Dr. Margot Selden was changing out of surgical gown when the marshals arrived. She heard the commotion in the corridor, the particular sound of federal authority moving through a civilian space, boots and badges, and the low-voiced directives that carry the weight of warrants and case numbers. She stepped into the hallway with her surgical cap still on, mask pulled down around her chin, and saw Nadine walking toward Gannon's office in a navy suit and a gold badge. Selden's face performed a rapid sequence: recognition, confusion, recalibration. The travel nurse who had reached for the ambu bag. The travel nurse whose hand she had slapped in this very scrub room. The travel nurse who had performed a pericardiocentesis with the precision of a board-certified surgeon. Standing in the corridor of her department, wearing the credentials of a federal agent, carrying the authority that Selden had spent 17 years believing, belonged exclusively to people who looked like her. Dr. Selden. Nadine stopped, held her gaze for 3 seconds. The same 3 seconds Selden had held her hand under the scrub room faucet, the same duration of sustained contact that communicated everything language could not. The Texas Medical Board will be contacting you regarding a formal inquiry. I suggest you retain counsel before that call. Selden's right hand, the hand that had slapped Nadine's, curled into a fist at her side. Not from anger, from the particular physical reflex of someone whose body remembered what it had done before. Her mind could construct a defense for it. You were. She could not finish, could not assemble the sentence that would explain how a chief of surgery had struck a federal agent in a scrub room and been too confident in her own hierarchy to consider that the person she was striking might occupy a hierarchy that outranked hers in every way that mattered. Nadine did not wait for the sentence to finish. She continued down the corridor toward compliance. Boyd Strattan was the last to be contacted. He was in the security office on the ground floor, monitoring the camera feeds that showed marshals moving through the building, when 2 Harris County deputies entered through the door he had never expected to see law enforcement use, the door to his own office. Boyd Strattan, we have a warrant for your arrest. Harris County case number 26-5742. Assault, Texas Penal Code Section 22.01. The deputy was professional, measured, performing the arrest with the procedural courtesy that Strattan had never extended to the people he searched and stopped and blocked in corridors. Please stand and place your hands behind your back. Strattan stood. His face showed the specific bewilderment of a man who had spent his career on one side of handcuffs and was now experiencing the other. The metal closed around his wrists with the click that he had heard 1,000 times but had never felt against his own skin. Cold, final, an acoustic punctuation mark that ended one version of his life and began another. As the deputies escorted him through the lobby, past the brass plaque and the water feature and the information desk where visitors checked in, Strattan passed the spot in the corridor where he had pressed his palm against the wall beside Nadine's shoulder and told her he knew every camera and every blind spot in the building. He had been right about the cameras. He had been wrong about who was watching them. She turned to the corridor, where a marshal was escorting Faye Gannon from the compliance suite. Gannon walked with the rigid posture of someone who had spent her career ensuring that paperwork said the right things and was now realizing that saying the right things and being the right things were not the same. In Gannon's office, the forensic team found 13 compliance reports filed by hospital staff between the prior January and the present month. All 13 had been marked resolved within 72 hours of submission. None had generated an investigation. The resolution notes, written by Gannon in identical language across all 13 files, read, "Coding error corrected. No further action required." 13 separate staff members had reported billing discrepancies. 13 times, Gannon had closed the report before anyone with authority to investigate had seen it. 13 times, the system had performed its function, not the function it was designed for, but the function it had been repurposed to serve, containment. And in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet in Gannon's office, behind a row of empty hanging folders, the forensic team found a shredder bin containing 47 pages of partially destroyed documents. Consent forms, billing batch reports, and 3 pages of what appeared to be internal correspondence between Gannon and Celeste Marrin discussing coding optimization strategies. The shredding was incomplete. The crosscut had failed midway through the batch. A mechanical jam that left 12 pages intact enough to read. One of those pages contained a sentence that AUSA Reyes would later describe, in her sentencing memorandum, as the clearest evidence of knowing participation in a scheme to defraud the United States government. Per your guidance, the batch submissions for Q3 have been adjusted to reflect the revised procedure codes. Projected reimbursement increase, approximately $1.2 million. Projected reimbursement increase, not error, not correction, increase. The language of someone who understood exactly what she was doing and had chosen to do it in writing. Celeste was in her office on 7 when Nadine arrived with AUSA Reyes and 2 marshals. The office was dark. Celeste had not turned on the overhead lights, only the desk lamp, a warm circle of yellow that made the rest of the room feel like dusk. She was sitting behind her desk, hands flat on the surface, the framed photograph of her 20-year-old self still on the credenza behind her. She looked at Nadine, looked at the badge, looked at the suit, and then she looked at the face she had threatened in a corridor, the face she had shoved in an operating room, and something behind her eyes collapsed. Not the performance of someone preparing a defense, the genuine disintegration of someone who had built a world on assumptions that had just been proven catastrophically wrong. Callaway. She said the name differently now, not as a common surname on a badge, as the name on the building, the name above the lobby entrance, the name on the brass plaque she had walked past every day for 22 years without polishing. Yes, you're his Harold Calloway's granddaughter, Lorraine Calloway's granddaughter, and the majority shareholder of this hospital. Nadine's voice was not triumphant, was not cold. It carried the particular weight of someone who was dismantling a thing they had hoped to save. I'm also a special agent with the HHS Office of Inspector General. I've been embedded in your surgical department for 28 days. Everything I observed has been documented and submitted as evidence in a federal investigation. Celeste's hands, flat on the desk, curled into fists, not in anger, in the reflex of someone trying to hold onto a surface that was tilting. Hattie, she whispered. Hattie knew. Hattie knew the hospital was failing its patients. She filed 37 incident reports over 7 years. Not one was investigated. Celeste closed her eyes. Behind her, the photograph of her younger self, hungry, hopeful, holding a stethoscope she had been told to use for healing, watched from the credenza like a witness who could not testify. A USA Reyes stepped forward. Ms. Marrin, you are not being arrested at this time. The investigation is ongoing. You will be contacted by our office regarding a formal interview. I strongly advise you to retain counsel. Any statements you make from this point forward may be used in subsequent proceedings. Celeste opened her eyes, looked at Nadine one more time. She told me to heal first. Her voice was barely audible. Your grandmother's friend. She put that stethoscope in my hands and told me to heal first, climb later. She paused. I climbed first, and I forgot how to heal. Nadine said nothing. There was nothing to say. Some confessions are not meant to be answered. They are meant to exist, spoken into a room, heard by the walls, filed alongside the evidence in a case that would take months to adjudicate and years to resolve. She turned and left the office, walked past the boardroom where 9 chairs sat empty around a mahogany table, past the elevator bank where Celeste had retreated after the OR incident with heels clicking a rhythm that sounded like ownership, down the corridor, past the floors where patients slept and monitors beeped and the building continued its work of keeping people alive despite the failures of the people running it. The aftermath unfolded the way institutional aftermaths always do, in stages, through bureaucracy, at the speed of systems designed to absorb shock rather than respond to it. Within 72 hours of the warrant execution, the following actions were taken, each one a brick in a wall that would take years to build and might never reach high enough to prevent the next version of the same failure. Boyd Strattan was arrested on a warrant issued by the Harris County District Attorney's Office. The charge was assault, Texas Penal Code Section 22-01, based on the corridor incident documented in Nadine's case file and corroborated by surveillance footage recovered from the hospital's servers before deletion could be completed. He was booked, processed, and released on $15,000 bond. His attorney, provided by the Hospital Security Officers Union, filed a motion to dismiss within 48 hours, arguing that the physical contact described in the complaint did not meet the statutory threshold for assault. The motion was pending. Dr. Margot Selden was referred to the Texas Medical Board for investigation of unprofessional conduct, specifically the physical contact with a subordinate in the scrub room and the pattern of exclusionary scheduling that Tomas's notebook, now entered as Exhibit 47 in the federal case file, documented over 3 years. The medical board opened a formal inquiry. Selden's surgical privileges at Callaway Memorial were suspended pending the outcome. Her attorney released a statement calling the referral premature and procedurally irregular. The board's investigation was expected to take 6 to 12 months. Faye Gannon was indicted by a federal grand jury on 3 counts of obstruction of justice, 18 U.S.C. Section 1, 1519, related to the destruction of documents subject to the preservation order attached to the subpoena. The partially shredded correspondence between Gannon and Celeste, the coding optimization email, was entered as the primary exhibit. Gannon's attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement within the first week, which meant that Gannon would provide testimony against Celeste in exchange for a recommended sentence of no more than 18 months. The agreement was sealed. The details would emerge later, in proceedings that moved at the deliberate pace of federal prosecution. Dirk Lazenby retained counsel, invoked his Fifth Amendment rights during his initial interview, and then, 3 days later, contacted AUSA Reyes through his attorney to discuss cooperation. The conversation lasted 4 hours. At its conclusion, Lazenby agreed to provide a full accounting of the scheduling manipulation, the supply log falsification, and the consent form procedures that had been used to generate inflated Medicare claims. His testimony would form the backbone of the False Claims Act case, 31 U.S.C. Section 3729, that the U.S. Attorney's Office was building against the hospital's operating entity. Celeste Marrin was suspended without pay by the board, a vote of 8-1, with Thorne abstaining because abstaining looked better than voting against someone he had already destroyed. She was not arrested, not indicted, not yet. The AUSA's office described her status as subject of an ongoing investigation, which meant that the evidence was being assembled, that the grand jury had not yet been convened, and that the decision to charge or not charge would depend on how much cooperation the subordinates provided and how much of the fraud could be attributed to Celeste's direct knowledge versus institutional negligence. The hospital was placed under a preliminary corporate integrity agreement with CMS, a consent decree that required independent monitoring of all billing submissions, quarterly audits of surgical consent procedures, and the appointment of an external compliance officer to replace Gannon. The agreement would last 5 years if finalized. Whether it would be finalized depended on negotiations between the hospital's board, the OIG, and CMS, negotiations that would take months and generate hundreds of pages of legal documents that said in carefully worded paragraphs what everyone already knew. The system had failed, and the system was promising to fix itself using the same tools that had allowed the failure in the first place. Dr. Elias Thorne was appointed interim CEO by the board, a decision made within 48 hours of Celeste's suspension, with the speed and smoothness of a transition that had been planned long before the crisis that justified it. He held a press conference in the lobby, standing in front of the tarnished brass plaque, and announced a new era of transparency and accountability at Callaway Memorial. He did not mention that he had recorded the OR incident on his personal phone and waited 23 days to reveal it. He did not mention that a patient had nearly died during those 23 days while he calculated the optimal moment for maximum institutional damage. He spoke for 11 minutes, used the word integrity 7 times, left through the administrative entrance, away from the reporters, in a town car that was already idling when the press conference began. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because stories like this are how the truth gets told. On the afternoon of the 3rd day after the warrant, Nadine returned to the 4th floor. Not as a nurse, not as an agent, not in any official capacity. She walked through the corridor in her own clothes, jeans, a blouse, the shoes she wore when she was not pretending to be someone the institution could dismiss. And she stopped at the nursing station where she had sat for 28 days, drinking coffee from a communal pot, documenting the systematic failure of a hospital her grandfather had built to serve people who had nowhere else to go. Tomas was there, restocking the supply cart with the quiet efficiency that had defined his 18 years. He looked up when she approached and studied her face, the same face but different now, the face of someone who no longer needed to hide. "So," he said, Not a travel nurse. Not a travel nurse. He set down the package of gauze he was holding, looked at his hands. 18 years. I documented what I saw because nobody asked me to, and because I didn't know what else to do with it. I thought the notebook would stay in my locker forever. I thought nobody would ever... He stopped, swallowed. Thank you for making it matter. You made it matter. You kept the record when the system wanted it erased. That's not nothing, Tomas. That's everything. He nodded, picked up the gauze, returned to restocking. The work continuing. The floor continuing. The hospital continuing to operate, to admit and discharge and treat, because institutions do not stop when their leaders fail. They absorb the failure and keep running, the way a body absorbs a wound and keeps breathing, not because the wound doesn't matter, but because stopping would be worse. In the lobby, the brass plaque still read, "Founded 1971 by Dr. Harold Callaway, dedicated to healing without distinction." Someone had cleaned it. The tarnish was gone. The letters caught the afternoon light the way they had when they were new, clear, legible, making a promise that the building had spent years breaking, and might now, slowly, with the painful uncertainty of all institutional reform, begin to keep. Nadine touched the plaque as she passed, ran her fingers over the letters of her grandfather's name, felt the weight of what it meant to own a building full of people who had treated her as disposable, and to choose, despite that, to fight for the building rather than burn it down. Outside, the Houston sun pressed its usual weight on the parking lot, Lot C, behind the loading dock, where travel nurses and housekeepers and dietary staff parked their cars because the sorting happened before you made it inside. She walked past the dumpster corral, past the linen delivery bay, past the line that separated the people the institution valued from the people it used. Her phone vibrated. Encrypted channel, a USA Reyes. The forensic team pulled the deleted surveillance footage from the backup server. Most of it's intact, including the OR incident, but there's a gap. 10 minutes and 14 seconds, starting at 8:39 a.m. on the 14th, the exact window of the tamponade crisis and your pericardiocentesis. The primary recording was overwritten manually from Strattan's security terminal at 11:22 p.m. on the same day. Someone deleted that specific segment 7 hours before the risk management preservation request hit his desk. 10 minutes and 14 seconds. The exact moment Celeste shoved her. The exact moment she saved a man's life. Erased by someone who understood that the footage was a liability, but not erased well enough, because backup servers existed that security officers did not always remember to check. Can you recover it from the backup? Partially. The backup captured approximately 70% of the segment. We have the shove. We have the beginning of the pericardiocentesis. We're missing the last 3 minutes, including the moment Thorne started recording from the gallery. A pause. Which raises a question. Thorne's personal recording covers the gap perfectly. His footage starts where the backup cuts out. If he was recording from 8:44, he would have seen the gap in the official system, or caused it. The implication settled slowly, the way implications do when they change the shape of an investigation. Thorne's recording was not just opportunistic, it was precisely timed, beginning at the exact moment the primary surveillance was interrupted, as if he knew the cameras would stop, because he had arranged for them to stop, creating a gap that only his phone could fill, ensuring that the only complete record of the crisis belonged to him. He didn't just record the incident, Nadine said. He engineered the record. That's a theory. We'd need Stratton's terminal logs to confirm who initiated the deletion. If it was Strattan acting on Thorne's instructions, then Thorne didn't just want Celeste's job. He wanted to control the evidence that gave it to him. Silence on the channel, the kind of silence that means the case just got bigger. I'll flag it for the team. This may extend the investigation timeline, possibly significantly. Possibly significantly. The federal government's way of saying, this is not over. This may never be over. The rot may go deeper than the floor we've excavated, and the tools we're using to dig may not reach the bottom. Nadine ended the call, stood in Lot C between the dumpsters and the loading dock, in the shadow of a building that carried her name and her grandfather's legacy, and the accumulated weight of every decision made inside it, good and bad, healing and harmful, the kind that saved lives and the kind that destroyed them. She thought about Celeste, in a dark office, holding the memory of a stethoscope, about Thorne, in a charcoal suit, holding a phone that might contain evidence of something worse than what it had been used to expose, about Gannon's shredder, jammed on page 35, the mechanical failure that had saved 12 pages of truth from disappearing, about Hattie's folder, blue, labeled personal, 37 reports spanning 7 years, each one a small act of faith that someone, someday, would ask to see them, about Tomas and his notebook. 18 years of watching, 18 years of writing. The quiet, stubborn, unglamorous work of keeping a record when the institution wanted silence. She unlocked her car, sat in the driver's seat, did not start the engine. On the passenger seat, the sealed envelope from the courier lay open, empty now except for one document she had not yet filed. A single page from the Callaway Family Trust, a provision she had read but not yet acted on. Article 12, Section 1. The majority shareholder may, at any time and for any reason, convene a special meeting of the operating entity's board of directors for the purpose of removing and replacing any officer of the corporation. She could remove Thorne, could exercise the authority her grandfather's trust had given her, and undo the appointment that the board had made in the chaos of Celeste's suspension. Could install a CEO who was not waiting for someone to fail but working to make sure no one did. But not yet. Not until the investigation answered the question that the missing 10 minutes had raised. Not until the terminal log showed who had deleted the footage and whether the man now sitting in the CEO's office had orchestrated the very crisis he claimed to be resolving. She started the engine, pulled out of Lot C for the last time. In the rearview mirror, Callaway Memorial Medical Center stood against the Houston skyline. 400 beds, 1,100 employees, a brass plaque in the lobby that promised healing without distinction. The building looked the same as it had 28 days ago when she had walked in carrying a duffel bag and a cover story. But buildings, like people, are not defined by how they look. They are defined by what happens inside them when no one with the authority to stop it is watching. Someone was watching now, and the 10 minutes and 14 seconds of missing footage, the gap between what the institution recorded and what it chose to erase, remained unexplained, sitting in a federal evidence log like a locked door in a building full of people who had run out of keys. The Houston sun dipped toward the skyline. Traffic hummed on the freeway overpass. And somewhere in the building behind her, a phone rang in the interim CEO's office, Thorne's office now, and rang and was not answered.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.